So to transition us, I'm going to turn my camera off and I'm going to play some music and I'm going to move our two wonderful keynote speakers to the spotlight. I will allow the music to play and I want you to actually engage. I chose this song very specifically, and so I want you to engage deeply with this song as we transition before opening remarks to the keynote. So I'm going to turn my camera off. I'm going to remove the spotlight and play music.
As long as there have been human beings, the human beings have gathered in the summer at different times of the year to celebrate being human beings. And so to me, this is kind of a form of that, what's happening in this technological, digital reality that we're in. So it's good to see that everyone's bringing their energy here in a way that's really about celebrating and feeling good. So this is kind of, this is the part of the kind of reality that our reality needs, this kind of healing. Well, I was a long time up here, on the wrong subject. Human beings, right? Because most of you are not my generation. I came out of the generation that did whatever we did in our own way to try to make things better for your generation. There were accomplishments and there were things that weren't really quite accomplished and that were kind of fuzzy and hazy things, I think, still. But one is that I think is important. We remember that we're human beings, that we recognize ourselves as human beings, because that's the reality of who we are.
You just heard the words of John Trudell, Native American poet, author, and this brilliantly brings us into our conversation today as we think about being human, as we think about our responsibility to this work. My name is Jasmine Lee Story. I will be your moderator for our keynote on land and healing. When I was a child, I lived on an island on the southern eastern coast. My parental grandmother stayed with us while recovering from an ailment. She'd sit outside and watch as me and my siblings, we played on just in the island's natural wonder. She'd share games with us that encouraged us to deeply interact and play with nature. I remember fondly following around the yellow butterflies as she would instruct. If you could get a yellow butterfly, you'll get a yellow dress. The yellow butterflies bring blessings, and she had us engage and follow them around. Unfortunately, we rarely saw yellow butterflies on the island. I have since moved nearer to where my grandmother spent her childhood. And on my farm, I wake up to scores of yellow butterflies, flapping their wings, bringing joy and blessings. The magic of my grandmother's game has now been amplified now that I'm in the environment of the game's origin. Though I may carry the knowledge she shared with me, it wasn't until I was nearer to her environment, her childhood space, her home, that I could actually appreciate the wonder that was rooted in the knowledge. And so that brings us to our conversation today about the relationship between land and healing. Let me make sure, get Dr. Mandela back up here. All right. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to our keynote speakers. After we met the first time together, it was very clear that they could bring themselves into a room far better than I possibly ever could dream. And so with that, that is exactly how we are going to go. We're going to have self-introductions. I've already introduced myself, so I'm going to pass it to Dr. Valandra.
Good morning, everybody. Or yeah, still morning where I'm at. I have met some of you. Some of the names are familiar. I had the pleasure of meeting Dr. Mandela about a week or so ago, and immediately I thought of him as a younger brother. And of course, that carries all kinds of implications and responsibilities when you do that. But I am from, as an introduction, my people are, we call ourselves the Ocheti Shakoi Oyate, people of the Seven Council Fires. We are located in a, for reference for people. I don't care to use it, but that's how people are socialized. So my homelands are in the Northern Plains, North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Wyoming, Montana, parts of Minnesota, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan. That was our traditional homelands. And I always like to say that we are still settler occupied. We still have settlers in our territory. And I do that intentionally to let people know that we are still in the resistance, still saying that this is our homelands, this is our territory, and we have a relationship with it. And that's what I'd like to at least in terms of erasure, bring that out. Also, I think too, oftentimes we are called Lakota people. We have two other dialects, Dakota and Nakota. But within this theme, I think we often emphasize kinship. And I always find that true among Indigenous peoples globally, this notion of kinship. And, that's why when I met Dr. Mandela, I swear he could have been from my nation. One thing about Indigenous people, we have humor. And so I said to Dr. Mandela, I said, you must be Lakota, you must be. And of course, he knew I was leading up to something. And I said, because you must be Lakota because you're smart and good looking. And so we had a good laugh over that. And that's how we generally, with Indigenous peoples, lots of humor. It's a good way to begin building relationships. So I'm happy to be here. I thank Jazz for inviting me, and I'm looking forward to hearing the rest of the speakers and also the questions. There's a lot of ground to cover, and she had sent us some questions that I thought were very insightful, and I want to be able to engage all the attendees. So thank you.
Thank you. I'm just going to be beaming throughout this whole conversation. I adore both of these human beings so much. And so with that, I pass it to Dr. Mandela to bring himself into the room.
Thank you very much, Jazz. I hope can you please give me a thumb up if I'm audible enough? Okay, perfect. Well,
yes and no.
We live in a very problematic times in South Africa. It's the evening on my side, so if you see me and in my background I get darker and darker, don't confuse it and think that I'm probably affected by some forces of darkness. That's not the case. We have some blackout issues. We have some blackout issues that actually force me to drive and get where I can easily have access to reception so I can be connected. So I'm speaking with you from my car at the moment. So you'll pardon me if it gets darker and darker. But my name is Siyabulela Mandela. I hail from the kingdom of the Tembu people, which is situated in the eastern parts of Eastern Cape in South Africa. I am a descendant of King Ngubengcuka. I stand in the shoulders of my ancestors, Madiba, Sopicho, Yemyem, Olomsila, Zonda Zinjaba, Nobaz Namzonda, Ngeke Zmenzendo. I am coming from the fifth house of the Tembu Kingdom. The Tembu Kingdom, how it's configured, the configuration of the Tembu Kingdom, it has 5 houses. I hail from the house of Mandela, which is the fifth house of that kingdom, whose responsibility is to mediate when there is a conflict on the first 4 houses of the kingdom. Of course, I speak the language Xhosa, which is a language that is similar to a language that is spoken by those that come from the Xhosa kingdom. I am not Xhosa, however, I am Tembu. Our kingdom was, of course, recently restored to us. It was taken away in the 1900s by the British colonial system during the colonial era. And it was only restored in 1994 when my great-grandfather Nelson Mandela became the first Black democratically elected president of South Africa. And it is within that kingdom that I identify myself and I find my connection with the Tembu Kingdom. I will dwell and engage further on what it means to be part and parcel of that kingdom and what it means to be connected to the land that for a very long time was stolen away from us, and pieces of that land have not yet been returned, which also speaks into some of the issues that I will deliberate on at a later stage. And it is a pleasure indeed to once again meet with my elder Edward. And I'm looking forward to be adopted as one of the younger brothers to Edward's clan and family. So it is a pleasure. And to the rest of the panelists, it's a pleasure and an honor to meet all of you. I have taken a very decolonial approach to introducing myself. A more colonial one would lead me to talk about my accolades and degrees and all those colonial kind of things, but this is not the place and time to engage in such issues. So I would rather stick to a more decolonial way of introducing who I am. So thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to the conversation that we are about to have. Thank you, colleagues.
Thank you so much. Thank you both for bringing yourself into the room, for really helping us start off on having this conversation about decolonization in an active way through also practicing even how we bring ourselves into a virtual space that is still heavily formed by those systems. So the first question that I have is a two-folded question. Is there a relationship between justice and land? Is there a relationship between healing and land? And I left them big and open because I want you all to grab any part of that that you would like and just run with it. So I will repeat it again. Is there a relationship between justice and land? Is there a relationship between land and healing? And you'll see that Amanda's also shared that in the chat for all of the attendees as well.
So, can you hear me? Okay. I don't know where Jazz comes up with these questions, but they are very profound, let me tell you. The one about these relationships between justice and land and healing in the land. I would have to say as Lakota people, the best way I could explain that is that we understand that the natural world has personality. And what I mean by that is it's in my language. For example, when we talk about the natural world and other people in the natural world, we use terminology like Tatanka Oyate, which is the Buffalo people or Buffalo Nation. Mini Oyate, the water people are the water nation. And that's just even what the West would call inanimate objects like the inaugural, which is the rock nation, or the rock people. And we consider them the oldest relative to the Lakota people. And because we look at the world that way, inhabited by not just humans, but peoples. And that's why we believe that the natural world has personality and personhood. And for Lakota people, we want to be in relationship because that was our original instructions. The original instruction was to be a good relative. And to be a good relative means you do no harm. And so then we spent, since time immemorial, working out these relationships with the natural world, human and non-human. And I think that becomes, I think, profound in a lot of ways too. I once recall reading and talking with some of the Lakota people about the sacredness. And to me, the sacredness, as it was explained to me and as I understand it, the Christians came and explained what a miracle was to my people. And we looked at the Christians and said, and the example they used was that when St. Peter was held prisoner and he was locked in these shackles. And then the Christians explained how that was a miracle because the angels came down and they opened the shackles and so they said, well, that's what a miracle would be. And my people said, that's not a miracle. And it just stunned the Christians. Like, how can that not be a miracle? He said, well, let us explain what a miracle is to us. He said, the miracle to us would be that if he was in his shackles and if he was freed, but he had no outside help, because in that story, the angels come and open the shackles for St. Peter. We said if St. Peter was free without opening the shackles, that to us is a miracle. And the priests were saying like, well, the Christians were saying like, well, how can that even be? We said, because it's about transformation. It's about transformation. And so to explain that to them, we took pumpkin seeds and apple seeds and said, look at these corn seeds. We said, look at these. They will transform as seeds into a pumpkin, as seeds into an apple tree, as seeds into corn. That's the transformation. So that's a miracle to us. And so every day when we step out into the natural world, we are inundated with the miracles all around us. And that is the sacredness that we have as Lakota people. That's why I think to us, the natural world is a very sacred place. And we acknowledge that because of the transformations that for us are the miraculous thing and has very little to do with, as in that story that was told about the angels coming and freeing St. Peter. We said that's not a miracle because that's something that happens all the time among our peoples. We call on spirits to help us in a lot of ways. And we have ceremonies around those things. So I think we have a very different understanding about what the relationship between land and justice, healing and justice, the land and justice components to be a good relative. So we are often in relation with the natural world. And then the healing part of that, I think, is to ensure that we do no harm as a relative to all that's around. So that's a bit of my bent into theology. I don't know if I made myself clear, but it seems to me that We understand miracles differently. Miracles are transformative. They happen innately. So that's just probably a small look into why we consider the earth a sacred being. You know, we call the earth Unchimaka. She is our grandmother. And we mean that literally, not like metaphorically, not like romantically or anything. We say Unchimaka. That is our grandmother. And so we have in my language a lot of that kind of thinking about the natural world, and it's all relation based. So
Thank you. Man, it's hard being a moderator because I want to act like we're just sitting in a coffee shop somewhere and respond. But all right, Madiva, same question. Is there a relationship between justice and the land? Is there a relationship between healing and the land?
Thank you very much, Jess, for that question. And thank you to my elder, Dr. Edward, for such an eloquent explanation of what justice means and the relationship between justice and the land, and the relationship between the land and healing. I want to probably begin by giving a brief background on the history of my people. By my people, this, for the benefit of this conversation, I would include all the oppressed people in South Africa and the injustices that befell them during the colonial era and during the apartheid regime. One thing that is of critical importance is to indicate that to us in the southern parts of Africa, which is probably something more similar to the rest of the African continent, our challenges began when those of European descent or those of Caucasian descent came into our lands, and we welcome into our lands. And the assumption that they made was to arrive and to begin by identifying pieces of land and claim that they have discovered the new land. In South Africa, they arrived in 1652. It was a fellow from the Dutch lands in Europe. His name was Jan van Riebeeck. He claimed to have discovered what became known as the Cape of Good Hope, many knows as Cape Town today. That was the beginning of the injustices and the pain and the trauma and the violence that was going to follow for years to come. One thing that those that we can consider settlers and colonizers, one of the things that they did was to first and foremost seize the land. And when they went through the process of what they call settler colonialism, they identify pieces of our land that they think will be beneficial for their settlements. And they pushed out or pushed away the indigenous communities from the land, and they pushed them towards pieces of land that were either not conducive for living or for producing anything that would give life to the indigenous communities. That was the era between 1652 leading up to the 1940s. And it does, for us, it was the period of the beginning of colonialism in South Africa. It was even later characterized by vicious and senseless violence from 1948, when they introduced what became known as the apartheid system. But before the apartheid system, what we've noticed in our land was in 1652, it was when the English and the Dutch arrived in our land. And when they've arrived, they carried along with them the dispute that they were having in Europe, and they fought what became known in our lands, became known as Anglo-Boer War. Anglo means the English, the Boer means the Dutch. And these two, what they did successfully is the application of what became known as divide and conquer strategy in their colonial system. The divide and conquer meant that the indigenous communities were divided between these two colonial brothers, the English and the Dutch. And they viciously and relentlessly fought what became known as Anglo-Boer Wars. And these were the wars that they were fighting between each other, the English and the Dutch. In between them were indigenous communities who were forced to pick up sides. And in the process of picking up those sides, those who refused to join forces with either the English or the Dutch were punished severely. And there were those who decided to choose the side were promised that they will be given land, which was stolen from them, and some benefits after those wars. It was up until 1948 when the English and the Dutch decided that the best way to move forward was to actually come together and colonize violently the oppressed, the indigenous communities. It was the beginning of what became known as the apartheid regime in 1948. Between 1962 and of course, up until 1948, the indigenous communities waged a relentless struggle against that colonial system. But because of the nature of the kind of people that we were, and our ancestors, that sometimes I usually blame them for that, they adopted policies in their struggle against colonialism called the non-violent struggle against a vicious and a violent system. It was only up until the introduction of a more vicious and violent system called the apartheid that the younger generation, the generation of Nelson Mandela in the 1950s, decided that they are going to abandon the non-violent struggle against colonialism and adopt a more violent struggle, targeting the key infrastructure and the structures of the apartheid system and the colonial system in general. I think this is the phase and this is the period that resonated well with me, because not that I'm a violent person, but I think I agreed more with the approaches that the generation of the 1960s adopted as opposed to the previous policy of non-violence against the regime and against a system that understood only language. And the language that they understood best was violence. It was unfortunately that violent struggle from late 1950s to late 1940s, 1980s, it was met with a severe violent response by the apartheid regime, and leading to many of those who were fighting that struggle for liberation to be arrested and be sent into life imprisonment, including my great-grandfather Nelson, was sent into prison for about 27 years. And many of his brothers and sisters and comrades were also arrested, and they were sent in prison and severely punished for fighting for what was rightfully theirs. First and foremost, their land, their country, their heritage, their identity. Some of the issues that I'll speak into a bit later. It was up until 1990s, late 1980s, up until 1994, that the apartheid regime realized that it was impossible to fight the resistance from the indigenous communities. And they decided that we should come into, actually they considered to come into the negotiation table. And one of the first demands was to release our fathers and our mothers and our brothers and our sisters were arrested, waging a relentless struggle against these oppressive regimes. And when they engaged in the negotiation table, there were a lot of trade-offs that were done between 1990 and 1994. And one of those problematic trade-offs was the decision to negotiate on the question of land. In 1994, while we received what became known, we realized what became known as the dawn of a democratic dispensation in South Africa, we only got, in terms of the liberation movement, we only got the political power, and we compromised on the economic power and the land question. In 1994, we did not see any transfer of the land that was stolen by the colonial regimes and by the apartheid system in South Africa. And the assumption in 1994 that my great-grandfather, Nelson Mandela, and his generation made was that when they negotiated and they got the transfer of the political power, and that meant that our people were now allowed to vote and decide who should lead them and who should determine the future of that generation and generations yet to come. What they did not realize was that there was never going to be any reconciliation in the country until the land question was addressed. And of course, my great-grandfather's regime between 1994 up until 1995 embarked on what became known as the Truth and Reconciliation process. In that period, it was a time where we really looked at what happened in the past. By the past, I mean during the colonial system and during apartheid. And in that period, what we realized is there was some kind of reconciliation that was forged, but which was forged without a clear and a concrete foundation. While South Africans managed to come together, they were unfortunately unable to reconcile. And what that meant is justice in South Africa was not served, because in that period, we noticed what I call as the miscarriages of the negotiation process, where we negotiated on the land question. Why today, 25 years later, since the dawn of democracy, South Africa is unable to heal, South Africa is unable to reconcile that the majority of Black and previously oppressed grouping in South Africa argue that justice has not yet been served. It's because more than 25 years later, since the dawn of democracy, 80% of the land is still in the hands of the minority, the white people, those who colonized us. And what the land means to us as Tembi people and many ethnic groups that exist in South Africa is that we first and foremost identify with the land. Our identity is intricately linked to the land. When I point to the piece of the land, whenever I go home, I ought to go and revisit the graves of my great ancestors. And it is within that land that I'm able to communicate and speak to my ancestors, ask for strength, ask for guidance, ask for direction, and ask for healing when I need healing. And whenever we perform any traditional ceremonies, we ought to go to the kraal, and that is where our land is. That is where the bones of our ancestors lie. When that piece of land is still in the hands of those that colonize us, it is now difficult for us to declare and say justice has been served, because part of who we are, our identity, is still in the hands of those that colonized us. Even though we achieve what from a political point of view is called a democracy, in terms of true meaning of justice, which would define justice according to land, because we identify with that. My heritage is according to that land. The bones of my ancestors lie in that land. The space for my spiritual healing and my abilities to communicate with my ancestors is through that land. There is no ceremony that I can perform. For instance, if I come and stay in the United States, there are certain things that I can't function and perform, such as traditional ceremonies, because I ought to be connected to the land of my ancestors so that I can be able to communicate with them. And of course, I can come in a space and say to you, I stand in the shoulders of my ancestors. But there are certain things that I cannot perform, traditional ceremonies that I cannot perform because they need me to access the kraal, and the kraal is geographically located in the land to which my ancestors come from. So when we speak of justice and healing, then it is near impossible to realize healing and justice when the land is not in the hands of those people to whom it belongs to. If the land for us is still in the hands of the minority, there is no way that we can reconcile. There is no way that we can heal. There is no way that we can say justice has been served. So I hope I have clearly given a background in terms of how that land and the history of my people is, and how we relate to the land. And because in the interest of time, I won't be able to, I'll probably be able to engage further on some of the issues as we progress in the conversation. I will hand it over to our moderator, Jess. I saw my elder has raised an hand. I will hand it over back to him, and let's see where the conversation leads us.
Oh my gosh, these young warriors, they give the old warriors, they get our blood running really fast, you know. And I would have to say the story of South Africa is the story of my people in the States. I really resonated with my younger brother, who said, we are of the land and we have certain ceremonies prior to the white settlers coming over that we perform since time immemorial. Like our New Year begins in the spring, like around March, the spring equinox. So we have ceremonies which we go to a certain place, and we call it the Wakia Oyate Agli. We're welcoming back the Thunder Nation. That's what we do. But because our colonizers, i.e. the Americans, have annexed our territory, have nationalized our territory, made it a public domain, they dictate when we can have the ceremony, how many people can have the ceremony, and it's so arbitrary that they can go ahead and say, you can't do that. You can't perform these ceremonies. And we have significant landmarks and ceremonial places in our territories where we perform certain ceremonies, because that was given to us. These ceremonies were given to us through the natural world, through our creator. So we have a responsibility to do that, to do those ceremonies. And often white settlers make it very difficult for us to do that. And why we do it was that was our covenant with the natural world, to say we will do these ceremonies to show that we will be in relation. We will honor one another. But our history, when I was listening to Dr. Mandela, that story he told could be put here in the States with our people as well. And we asked the Americans, the settlers, we say, we want land return. And this is the difference between how we think and how the settlers think. Often they say, what, give land back? You want us to give land, give the land back? And we have to say, no, you cannot give this land back because it was never yours to begin with. We're the only ones of our nation that can give land away. All you can do is return stolen land. You have to return it. And so we have to be very careful when we engage the settlers, because they use colonial language to, marginalize us. So when they say give land back, we say, no, you can only return it because you stole it. And I think that becomes part of our ongoing resistance to maintain who we are as a people and to do those ceremonies for the healing as well as for the relationship of justice. And that is justice. And I love Dr. Mandela's notion about truth and reconciliation, because as far as Lakota people are concerned, first you have to get to the truth. And that is very hard in the States, because that truth is very painful, and it goes against the settler narrative of how they discovered this land, how it was vacant, how there was hardly anybody here, and that's not true. And the reconciliation part is really a good point, because reconciliation might imply that there was a relationship that fell apart and everybody's trying to reconcile. But we have truly never had a relationship with the settlers. We have tried since they landed on the shores. I was reminded of a native leader. His name was Powhatan in 1609, told the settlers back then, why should you take by force that which you can obtain by love? And he laid it out to the settlers that what you need to survive, we can work together. We can be in relationship. And of course, 413 years later, that question has been answered, or that statement has been answered by just, annexation, nationalizing our territory, removing us, basically erasure. So, when I hear Dr. Mandela talk, I always say, well, our stories are so similar when it comes to colonization, that I would not be afraid to say that what's happened to my people, we would call it the South Africa of North America. Like what you just said parallels very much our history with the settlers and what they've done to, through genocide and the taking of our land, because it's very much tied to that. Our ceremonies are very much tied to that. And the justice that we talked about earlier, when I said how we experience the natural world. For example, when we talk about genocide, a lot of times among the West, the people in the West or the settlers, they think of it just in human terms. But if we talk about the Tatanka Oyate, the Buffalo people, the Buffalo Nation, who we have a relationship with, of course, our stories is we are descended from the Buffalo Nation. We have a relationship. And prior to that, we are descended from the Wichakabi Oyate, the Star Nation. And so we have these relationships that go back to the beginning. And so when the settlers came out, and they were killing probably on average 4,000 buffalo a day, to us, that was a genocide of a people. So when we look at not just humans, but plant life and and what we call the four-leggeds, the animals. I mean, that was a scale of genocide unknown in human history. There were maybe 70 million buffalo people in about 1868. By 1890, there was only 1,500 of them left. So from about 60 million down to 1,500 in a span of 20 years. My people seen that slaughter of buffalo. And that we have not gotten over yet. We still just cannot get over the magnitude of that genocide. So that's how we tend to look at what's happening with the settlers, is that they not only committed genocide against like indigenous peoples, but peoples of other nations, the Water Nation, the Eagle Nation, the Deer Nation, the Buffalo Nation, the Tree Nation, all these nations. And it just overwhelms, I think, even me to think about the scale of that genocide.
Thank you both so much. Edward, thank you so much for bringing in the really, like, what does it mean to be holistic about it? Our review of this history is to really include all of the genocides that are both past and actively being sustained every single day. And Dr. Mandela Madiba, thank you for giving us this history and context. I think that this is really important. A part of the reason why I dreamt up this particular keynote, as both of you know, I have been honored to be in both of your homelands in my lifetime. And I've also lived in some other places. And when I was younger, I kind of felt like I was on a tour of European violence, moving from country to country. And what was most striking to me as an academic were photos, and also being able to track some of these names and to look and say, there's a reason these structures of oppression look so similar, like down to the physical space, right? Like you look at, I'm so happy you brought the Anglo-Boer Wars. For everyone who doesn't know much about that, please go look up the Anglo-Boer Wars. This is where the English perfected what would become concentration camps and reservations. This is where they were able to practice. They practiced that on the Bora people, and they also practiced it on everybody else who was fighting on their side. And so when we track these histories across the globe, we can follow this. There's a reason why the ghettos of Germany look very, very similar to oppressive places that would then follow in the later half of the century, as well as oppressive places that preceded that violence. And so thinking about this on a global scale, my question to both of you is, what conversation about land and justice should we, and this we is a global we, be having? And before we do that, I want to just bring in one more thing. While living and studying in South Africa, I fell in love with the work of Bantu Steve Biko. And one of the things that Biko writes in his young days in the 70s is redefining this idea of Blackness and inviting this identity of Blackness to be a collective identity, the identity of the collective oppressed, that until the white oppressed working class man understood his relationship to this oppression, then and saw himself as Black, until the white woman in South Africa who suffers under patriarchy, though has the privilege and violence of whiteness, until she sees that she's Black, like until there is a collective raising of this consciousness. Often people think about Black consciousness as a Afrocentric piece, but young Biko was really dreaming of global revolution. And he said, no, we all have to come into this consciousness that Black should and could be a banner identity, an umbrella identity for people to see themselves and connect themselves, a political identity to connect themselves as global people who've experienced this consistent, persistent violence. And so I think a lot about what an honor it is to share this conversation with our global community. And so I want to pose the question back to you again. What conversation about land and justice should we, in a global we as a collective consciousness, we as all of us, what should we be having? What conversation should we be having about land and justice in 2022? And I'm going to pass it. I'm going to leave it open. I'll see whoever takes it first. Fastest one.
I'll let my younger brother take that one.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, my elder, for giving me those privileges. In my culture, I cannot speak up until the elders have spoken. And now this is, I think you are all witnesses that it was the elder that first gave me the permission to speak before him. So I will proceed. If in my previous submissions, I have indicated to us that the land to us is of critical importance. There is no healing without returning back the land to those to whom it belonged to. And one of the reasons that I've cited is the fact that first and foremost, when the land was taken away from us, we were stripped of our identity, we're stripped of our heritage, and we're stripped of our culture as the oppressed people in South Africa. And during that colonial period, there were a lot of things that were happening. First and foremost, you would understand, I think it's something that is, you'll pardon me if it's a bit darker. I think the power just left, but the internet is still around. So if you can still hear my voice, I assume that the forces of darkness have taken over, but I'm still here. When during the colonial period, one of the things that we've noticed that were very important to the colonizer was to erase our history, erase our identity, and erase our language, and replace our spaces in our land with their identity. And one of the things that you notice when you go to most, if not all, colonized former colonies is that when you come to South Africa, for instance, you land in my city, it's called Port Elizabeth, which is very problematic because that is not the indigenous name given by the indigenous people. And the name of that place is called Gqeberha, which is the indigenous name assigned to it. But the colonizers, because of their strategy to erase our history and our identity, was to remove and change the names and rename our cities, rename our buildings, rename our streets. And to an extent that cultural violence, it went to an extent that they gave us or our ancestors their name. My great-grandfather's name is called Rolihlahla Mandela. That means pulling the branch, and pulling the branch in my language, it means that the troublemaker, that was his name given to him by his father. But when he went to school, the first thing that the teacher gave him was the new name. And they said, your name from now on is going to be Nelson because we can't pronounce your name. And that was also part and parcel of erasing our history and our identity. So one of the things that my generation decided to identify was the only way that we can begin the process of healing and achieving justice is to decolonize our land and decolonize even in the education system itself. So the first thing of decolonizing the land meant that we have to rename everything. If you see a street called the Queen Elizabeth II Way or the Settlers Way, we ought to change all those names. So South Africa in this present moment is going through that process of decolonization of the institutions of higher learning and decolonization of the land. We are renaming our streets, we are renaming our buildings to an extent that as students will go to university lecture halls and they are named after those that used to colonize us. And one of the things that we advanced during what became known as FISMA School, which was a movement calling for decolonization of the education system and decolonization of the land, was to rename the buildings themselves. Because as students, we could not identify. You go to a lecture hall called Henry V. We don't even know who Henry V was. We have no relationship with this particular ancestor. We do not know who his father or his mother is. So the first thing that we said was, we are going to rename each and every university lecture hall to the ancestors that we know. So today, when you go to most universities, you're going to find Winnie Madikizela Hall or Steve Biko Hall or Nelson Mandela Hall. To us, these are the ancestors that we identify with. To us, if you tell me that the next lecture or class is going to be at Nelson Mandela Hall, I know automatically where is that hall because I identify with that particular name. But when the buildings were named Henry V, Queen Elizabeth, or any other colonial fellow, it was very difficult for us to even identify. And to some of our people, it might sound very funny, but I think even in terms of our navigation system, it was even difficult to navigate where is this Henry Hall, because these are the people that from our spiritual realm we can't even relate to. So we began that process of decolonization. So for me, those are some of the things that we need to begin talking about is how do we decolonize our spaces, our land, our education system, to a point where we even argue that it cannot be that we have books written by people that we can't even relate to. When our people, our professors, Dr. Edward, we don't have his books in our libraries, but the books that we have are the books written by the descendants of those that once colonized us. So in other words, the continuation of brainwashing and colonization of the mind of the oppressed is still continuing. So the other way of decolonizing is to decolonize the education system. Let's have books written by people that we can identify with, professors that we can identify with. As I open the book, I can easily identify this is Dr. Edward, or is a descendant of this kingdom. Their land is here. And I can easily immerse myself in that knowledge. And the manner in which they write is in the manner that I, as the person that is previously colonized, I can easily understand. And the other issue that I think is of critical importance as we begin to engage on the decolonial process is to include indigenous languages in the education system. Because if we continue to be educated, for instance, in the language of the oppressor, I don't think we can fully arrive to the complete justice and healing and decolonization that is necessary for us to be able to heal, for us to be able to move forward. Today, when I go, for instance, I've visited in Canada and in the United States, and the only time I could hear the language of indigenous communities is only when I go to the indigenous communities. But in the public spaces and even in official communication by government, there is nowhere where the languages of indigenous people feature. I think it is only in countries such as South Africa where we have 11 official languages, which includes the languages of the indigenous communities, including, of course, the language of the oppressed. But if you go to countries such as Canada, if you go to countries such as United States, if you go to countries such as Brazil, the indigenous languages are not featured in the day-to-day communication and official communication by government. And the only language that is represented if you go to the United States is English and French, only the languages of the oppressed. So the question then is, how do you expect people to heal? How do you expect people to be able to reconcile when their languages are not even represented? So those, for me, those are some of the things that I think as the global community, we need to begin to question as of why in this day and age, we only recognize the languages of our former colonizers and oppressors. I mean, in the US recently, I think I shared this story. I'm about to hand it over to my elder. I shared this story with my dear sister Jess. I was in Minnesota as a visiting scholar at St. John's University, and we had a panel discussion which was about the slave masters that appear in the American currency. And one thing that was surprising for me was, how is it possible that a nation that achieved the so-called democracy is still engaging on a conversation around having the slave masters appearing in their own currency? How is it possible that they did not address this issue 100 years ago? And to me, it would seem as something that is so weird and bizarre that I'll pick a South African currency, and in that currency, I see the face of the former colonizer, though the apartheid leaders. The first thing that we did as the country was to bring about the redress, those soft decolonization issues that we're talking about, making sure that we deal with our currency, and making sure that even our national anthem is representative of the languages of the indigenous communities. If you sing the South African national anthem, you'll find all 11 official languages represented in the national anthem. But if you go to the United States, the indigenous communities do not even feature. If you go to the currency, the faces of the leaders from the indigenous communities don't even feature in the currency, or in the American currency. The same thing in Canada, the same thing in Brazil, and so on and so forth. So those, for me, are some of the things that we need to begin to look at. If we are going to have a true reconciliation, if we're going to have healing, and if we're going to arrive to true justice, those are some of the things that we need to begin talking about, as of why do the slave masters are still in the currency? How is it possible that the languages of indigenous communities are not represented in America and in Canada and in other parts that are previously colonized? How is it possible that, as imperfect as our transformation process is in South Africa, how is it possible that South Africa is able to have 11 official languages that represent the languages of the indigenous communities and previously oppressed communities? How is it possible that South Africa can get it right in 25 years, in less than 5 years? Actually, we did that from 1994 up until 1999, something that America, 100 years later, still is unable to arrive at, and the same thing as Canada and other oppressed communities. So those are some of the things for me that we need to begin to engage on in a global community in order to drive to true healing and justice. Anyway, so I'll end it there at the moment. And sorry for taking a lot of time, my elder.
I think everyone will agree we can listen to Dr. Mandela all day. He is, I just resonate so much with what he says about indigenous languages and seeing ourselves in our own homelands. And and what the indigenous people of South Africa desired and wanted, we in the States want the same thing. Our challenges, and Dr. Mandela pointed that out when he was visiting the States and Canada, and he heard our languages, not in the public spaces, but in uniquely native spaces. And you know, one of the things that we can point to is that our languages are very different than the Western languages. Our languages it's even hard to explain what our languages do to us as Lakota people. Maybe the only thing I could probably, a short example would be, uh, uh, for example, we have one word, and it's Wiya. And so when the settlers came and they pointed at a female and say, what do you call this person in generic terms? And we said, that's a Wiya. Oh, and the settlers say, oh, that's a woman. So even the colonization of that, and then, so we had to set down the settlers and say, well, actually, Wiya, you call translated as a woman, but it comes from two terms, we, which is the sun, and Ia, which is the earth. And that's what a woman is for us. Wiya that's the literal meaning of the word. Sun, because sun gives us light, and then the earth nurtures us. So a Wiya, you may call her a woman, but it's more deep than that. And I appreciate it hearing, like, I would argue that we still have place names of the Northern Plains in our language. And if we were ever to develop a map and show the settlers, they would not even recognize that place. They would not even recognize the land they stole from us. And maybe as a project, we should identify all the places that the settlers have come in and renamed. And that has a lot more meaning for us as Indigenous peoples in our language. So I think language is a very, many of you may or may not know there were residential schools and boarding schools. And it was an extremely difficult time because they literally beat the languages out of our children. And so we're still trying to recover from that. Our language pool has gotten smaller and smaller over the generations, but fortunately, there's a fever among the younger children to want to learn our language again. And so there's that development. But for the global aspect of all of this, I was just thinking about, like, with climate change happening, I think the whites are beginning to come to the realization, like, oh my gosh, Western development has really put the earth in such dire straits. And when the settlers first came over, even 532 years ago, some of the first things we critiqued was their way of life. You do that, it's not going to be sustainable. And what I mean by that is, last night I was talking to a group of settlers, and I said, when the settlers came over, especially around the eastern seaboard, I said there was an estimated 14 billion passenger pigeons that when they flew, they would darken the skies. And by 1914, the last one died. How is that even possible? And there was the largest deciduous forest in the world between the Atlantic coast and the Mississippi River, such that a squirrel could run up a tree on the East Coast and not touch the ground until it hit the Mississippi River. And don't take my word for it. Read the early settler entries. They said those streams are so full of fish, you could walk across a river on the backs of the fish. So there was such abundance here that the late John Mohawk he's a Seneca scholar, said, you'd have to be deaf, dumb, and blind to have starved in North America before contact. And so we have all these narratives about that. And what happened? Well, colonization happened and Western development happened. And I think now we're having to, deal with the consequences of that. And I think the settlers are going to realize that they're going to begin to experience what it's like to be an indigenous person. When you have your natural bounty disrupted and even taken away, what that's going to feel like. And I think there's going to be some open spaces for everyone to have these discussions. And I don't know what that would look like or what that would lead to, but I do think there's a lot of truth telling that has to happen and a lot of the really difficult conversations about how we can be in relationship again in the natural world, or with the natural world. And I'm not sure what that would look like, to be honest with you, but I do know that my ancestors were telling the settlers even 150 to 175 years ago, this way of life you have is not going to benefit anyone. And that you have to have a relationship with the natural world. And I think I think climate change has been kind of having that focus. But from what I understand, it's a very difficult thing to have that because it's complicated. But the thing I think is that it gets down to basics. It gets down to simplicity. I think being in relationship with the natural world, however that may look, but I know as Lakotas, we would love to see the 60 million buffalo back on the northern plains. And we know that the stories we have about 60 million buffalo in the plains, when they would run, you could feel the earth shake. And what we didn't realize, well, what we did realize, and scientists are only beginning to find out, the hooves of the buffalo aerated the soil. And then the vibration of hundreds of thousands of buffalo started signaling to the seeds that it was time to start germinating, because vibration has frequency and frequency is energy. So, and these are things that we have in my language. When I was a chemistry student and they would explain things like frequency, and I said, we have that. We call it daku skanskan. What moves, moves. And we know it has energy and it has life. So it's these problems that people are dealing with today that we were aware of many years ago. And but because settlers thought our ways of life were so primitive and so barbaric that they totally ignored that. And renaming places, identifying sacred places is critical to that larger global movement. I mean, there are reasons why we call certain places certain names, and because we believe this, we have this relationship which is quite different than the West. The West is set up on a scientific method. You observe, you hypothesize, you set up experiments. Whereas we, as Lakotas, believe that the natural world, if you're in a relationship, animals will tell you where the medicines are. Like ducks will tell you where the medicines are. Buffalo will tell you where the medicines are. Trees will tell you a lot of things about the natural world. And so, so that's part of our epistemology. How we gain knowledge was through the natural world, because in relationship, they tell you different nations will tell you how to live well as a relative. And so there's that traditional ecological knowledge is vast and it's deep, but it's hard to talk to people about that. So
Thank you both for that powerful, powerful round. I am hearing that a part of the global conversation that we need to have is around decolonizing our experience on a day-to-day basis, from the signs that we see to the words that we read to the curriculum our children are experiencing, to connecting to global indigeneity in academia. That was something that I heard that I also was just like, yeah, like, why am I not reading? Why did I have to go to South Africa to read Steve Biko? Why did I have to go visit you at Rosebud to get? Oh my gosh, I don't even. Where is the book? I can't even think. Because everyone needs to buy it.
oh yes.
You know, right? Why are these not in our library? So for everyone who's an attendee here, I think that this is a really huge takeaway, right? Like, how are you decolonizing your everyday environment as a larger takeaway, and then a big takeaway about the languages where so much of our knowledge is hidden, and or not hidden, just plainly there and present. And so the importance of that being echoed by both of you, the importance of language, the relationship to the land and language. Last time I was with Madiba in person, he told me what the word for chicken means, and it blew my mind because I was like, that's exactly what a chicken is. A chicken has never made more sense to me than it does right now that I understand what your word for chicken translates to. What is it? It's the one that we chase, right?
Yes. It means mlego. That means the one that you chase. If you are to slaughter a chicken, you have to chase it. So that's how we name it, mlego. The one that you have to chase.
That would have been very helpful for me on my great aunt's farm when I was 10 years old. I would have understood what my role was. Oh, okay, my relationship to this fur family member is that they're the one that I'm going to have to chase. Right? So reconnecting this language. We're beautifully coming to our close. And so I want to pass it both to you for closing remarks, thoughts that you would like the group to leave with, thoughts that you might want to share with each other. The floor is yours.
Well, I think one of the things that is crucial is this notion of relationships and how they can be, I don't know, authentic or real. But I do know that they are, for the Lakota people, we when we come upon strangers, we don't want them to be strangers for too long, because one of the things about Lakota thought and philosophy, the thing about strangers is they're very unpredictable. So in our way, we try to figure out what your positionality is, and so that once we can identify, then we apply a kinship term. Because as a relative, like Dr. Mandela, I call him a younger brother. In my language, it's Misu. So in our Native communities, those relationships dictate obligations and responsibilities to each other, and how to be and what is appropriate. And that extends out into the natural world too. So it's a very respectful kind of relationship that happens. And also, Lakota people, I mean, we struggle so hard to make relatives of people, because we understand, again, for us, strangers are very unpredictable. But once we understand we have a relationship with them, we bring them into our community. And if they're uncle, auntie, grandpa, grandma, in-law even, that helps settle our world, because we know how they are to be. and we can expect that behavior. And that is the cornerstone of relationships for Lakota people, is that and those relationships are critical. Even in our language, we don't use, and we all have names, but we use relationship. So I even my daughter, who has a name, I don't call her by her name, I call her by the relationship. Michunk Sheila, my precious daughter. That's what I call her every day. And so we have relationships we address each other by, because they signify certainty and expectations. But the bottom line of all that is relatives do no harm to each other. So Dr. Mandela, you're up.
Thank you very much, my elder, Dr. Edward. And thank you, Jess. The way that I want to submit my closing remarks is to probably further build up on some of the submissions that my elder put forward. He spoke of when he was articulating his relationship, the relationship between the land, justice, and healing. You would notice that he mentioned some animals in that in his submission. He spoke of a buffalo, and I want to submit to you that when we speak of land, that is where this question of justice and healing becomes of critical importance. When we speak of land, we do not only speak of land as a piece of a geographical area. We speak of land and all its inhabitants that are in it. So I want you, when you come to South Africa or any African countries again, you must remember, when you go to the so-called safaris, when you go and see the animals there, our beautiful creatures, you must know these, from our heritage and our languages and identity and culture, these are some of the animals that we identified with, that were stolen away from us. And you go to these nature reserves called safaris, and you go ride animals, some elephants, and you go see some lions. You must understand these are some totems, African totems, that many of us identified. When you come to South Africa, for instance, there are ethnic groups called the Ndlovus, or the elephants. They identify with their elephant as part and parcel of their identity and their culture. When they see an elephant, they see their ancestors. When you go see it in the safari, you must understand that this is the heritage and the culture of the people that has been imprisoned for the longest of time, that have been stolen away from them. It has been imprisoned, and you are actually paying money and giving resources and contributing to the continuation of that colonization and that cultural violence. When you go see, for instance, the so-called lions, we have an ethnic group called the Ngonyamas. The Ngonyama means lion. The Ngonyamas, or the people of the lion, these are the ethnic groups that identify with that particular natural creature. And when you go to this nature reserve, you must remember that you are actually contributing to the continuation of that cultural violence to that particular ethnic group. So when my elder was speaking of the buffalo, it actually touched so deeply to me that I can't believe that we are the same people, and we believe in the same, we have the same things that we identify to, and we define our being, our spirituality, our identity, our culture, and our heritage in the same way as my elder and his people are defining their heritage and their identity and their history. So I think when we must have a holistic understanding of what we mean by land, and how do these relate to justice and healing. When I see these totems, African totems, these zebras, these lions, these elephants imprisoned in so-called nature reserves, these are some of the animals that in the history and in our past, they used to roam around our communities. Our people used to actually speak through those particular totems, through those animals. We used to get our direction, our wisdom from those particular animals, our healing from those particular animals. So when it is difficult for us to reconcile, when it is difficult for us to heal, you must understand holistically the depth of what we mean by the land itself. So those are my closing remarks to say, really, this is something that goes beyond just giving back a piece of land to a particular ethnic group. It means even the inhabitants, even the trees. There are trees that, if you go to that place, there's a particular route you can get if you want to heal someone of a particular illness. That's what we mean when we talk about the land. It's not only for the purpose of identifying it as a geographical area or having the bones of our ancestors being buried in that particular piece of land. It means all the inhabitants in it. So for me, those are some of my last submissions. And to many of you that are going to do some tourism kind of work, I know summer is approaching and you'll be heading to the southern parts of our land. You must remember, when you go see these elephants and these lions, these are African totems that have been imprisoned, stolen from us by the colonial regime, and they continue to profit from those by giving to you what they call as African safari. And you go see them and take pictures with them. They're taking pictures with our ancestors that have been imprisoned by our white colonizers, who are still to this day refusing to give back what belongs to us, our identity, our heritage, our culture, our dignity. So those are some of my closing remarks. I'm sorry for closing on such a very maybe harsh way, but indeed, I just wanted to remind all of us that when we continue to do such things, we are actually contributing. There's nothing wrong to go see how beautiful these totems are and how these beautiful creatures that we identify to live. But you must remember, when you pay your dollars and your rands and your euros, you're actually contributing in that cultural violence and actually enable that colonization and oppressive system to continue. Thank you very much, Jess, and thank you to my elder and to my fellow panelists and everyone that have attended.
Thank you so much. So we have questions, and so I want to make sure that we get those questions in. But before we do that, I would like to seal our conversation and really kind of provide us with a moment of breath and pause. I'm so deeply grateful for both of you, to have you in my world, but also that you shared this conversation with so many people today. It is an honor to be able to talk and listen and throw spaghetti at the wall. I'm so happy that both of you allow me to fill your ear with my own little radical rants. And so I want to seal us. I want to seal us not in English. And I'm going to actually share a song that I learned in the Eastern Cape. One of the things that I love to do is I love to cook with elders, and no matter where I am or where I'm living, and I was the only one who was willing to be in the middle of the night in the rural Cape, Eastern Cape, sitting in front of a fire, slow roasting chicken, and because of that, I was able to leave with song. And to seal us, I'm going to sing, and the translation, actually, Dr. Mandela, tell me, Bambalela, never give up, right? Yeah? Okay.
Yes, that means hold on and never give up, yes.
Uba bambalela, bambalela, uba bambalela, bambalela, uba bamba, 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 bambalela. Thank you both.
That's beautiful.
Goodness.
So now for the questions. We have two questions, and then we will allow ourselves to transition. We'll have a small transition moment of a sound bowl healing to then bring us into Christine's wonderful conversation that will bring us into another conversation about land in a completely different way. So the first question is, it seems like so much of this is tied to capitalism. How do we shift that hurry, that deprivation? It seems like so much of this is tied to capitalism. How do we shift that hurry, that deprivation?
Well, I think it's good to have frameworks like capitalism and socialism and all these different kind of frameworks to get a sense of how things do operate. I wonder just making choices on a very personal level about your morality, like how much do I participate in the destruction of the natural world via capitalism? I mean, it's overwhelming almost, but yet I think for my people, we know that we understand capitalism in a lot of ways, but we also know that colonization has been our struggle against, and that we have a better way now. What I fear is, should we be successful in our decolonization, and this has happened to many of my brothers and sisters who got their independence after colonization, that we just reenact those same structures again, and we're just as destructive as when the settlers or colonizers were in our homelands. So I always think for capitalism is so transactional in many ways. And I always say, again, relationships, kinship systems and relationships with the natural world are the transformative things that do happen. And so even an act of I really love what my younger brother said about these relationships. We do. Anytime we take something, we pray all the time and give thanks. And just to be aware that this is what this is all about. That prayer and acknowledgement of these relationships, I think for my people, that's probably one of the things I would do is, and we do that, we have small buffalo herds now, but when we need food, we just don't go out and shoot one. We have ceremony before we do that. We ask that which of those buffalo people will sacrifice themselves so that we may live. And that's often the case. And then a lot of times among that herd, when we do those ceremonies, one of them will walk out and sacrifice themselves. Then we take that. And then we have ceremonies around that. And so I think that kind of awareness is antithetical to capitalism, Marxism, socialism, whatever economic systems out there. I really think that kind of awareness is helpful.
Thank you. Madiba, do you have an answer to that question? I think it's going to be our last one just for time.
Okay. I thought I was going to probably tackle the second question. I think my elder has actually addressed.
You want me to give you the second?
Yeah. Just pass me this. Yeah, give me the second question. Yeah, I think my elder has answered that probably.
Okay, how would you recommend white identified folks who work in restorative justice really take on the work of committing to repair and not doing more harm? How do you recommend that white identified folk who are in restorative spaces really take on this work of not committing, of committing to repairing harm and not causing further harm? So, how
Um,
can white folks do what they need to do? I think that's the question.
I think for the longest of time, in the process of truth and reconciliation and decolonization, the tendency has always been that uh, the descendants of the oppressor or the colonizer seems to be the one that sets the term on how we should reconcile and how we should heal from the injustices of the past. I think it's of critical importance that the colonized and the oppressed people are allowed to take charge and to set terms on how we decolonize and how we can heal and how we can therefore reconcile from the violence and the trauma and the injustices of our past. I think that is very much of critical importance. There are certain things, for instance, as I come from a culture that is also very patriarchal, there are certain issues that as a man I cannot speak into. For instance, when you're talking about issues of addressing gender-based violence, particularly violence against women and girls, there are certain platforms where I cannot speak in those platforms because by default, I'm also part and parcel of the problem. So if you ask me on issues of gender equality, I tend to refuse to participate in terms of being a leading voice in that particular space because I am socialized in a very patriarchal society that therefore means by default I'm part and parcel of the problem that we are trying to resolve. So the least I can do is to listen on how I can probably unlearn some of the things that I've learned in this patriarchal system and also learn more ways of living that are more inclusive and equal. So that is how I recognize my privilege in that patriarchal society. That is how I recognize my position and the fact that I'm part and parcel of the problem. So therefore, I cannot then be a leading voice in the process of trying to bring about the transformation of that particular society and that particular space. And this is the same thing that I think our brothers and sisters who are descendant of those that once colonized and oppressed us need to recognize that they have a certain privilege and they need to recognize that there are certain spaces and certain conversations where they need to take a step back and be the listeners instead of the people that actually devise strategies and tactics on how we can transform or how we can decolonize and how we can heal from the injustices of our past. But what we see at present is that the very same descendants and the very same people who are setting the terms on how we can heal and how we can reconcile and how we can move forward as a human race. And I find that very problematic.
Well, thank you so much. I have to say, I agree with both y'all. 100%. Well, thank you so much. This is our time. I'm so grateful. I'm just so grateful. And I really hope that you enjoy Madiba. I hope you have a good night and you get back safely to your home. Thank you so much for driving and having this conversation in the car. Edward, thank you always for showing up and allowing me to listen and learn. I know that there are, 100 other people registered for this, but I'm particularly grateful for my own learning. And so I thank you both. And I will let you go. We have up next our sound bowl healing and breath work to help us transition into the next part of our conference. So everyone, please, I know you can see your use your reactions. Give a round of applause for our speakers as we transition into our next lecture. Yeah, loving it. I love seeing it.